from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Oh, there he goes. Now we're cooking.
Was it on? Oh.
Whoa.
Testing. Whoa. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little loud now.
Back off.
I miss my closet a little bit. It's very bright in here.
It does make me nervous to have all those cameras there, but
All right.
Is this too loud? For those of you who are microphone fans, are we gonna? We're okay.
All right. Hello. Welcome, everybody.
hello, and I hope I get the applause too. Otherwise, I was going to cry. Yeah. I know, I'm moving. Hold on.
Hello, everybody. Glad that you're here. Also, I just want to tell you, I don't do puns. I don't do puns. What?
Save that for air.
Save that for air? Okay, I'll repeat it. But you have to laugh then.
Given my last name, I get to be the first to welcome everybody to Pediatrics on Call, the podcast edition. That is always the podcast edition, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty much
The
everything.
live podcast edition. How about that?
Yeah, I like that. It's good.
Turn your microphone just a little to the side.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was popping my peas.
Well, your
I'll turn it there. Is that
enthusiasm
still
well up.
okay? Good, you got it.
Everybody likes a good fricative, Lewis. The bilabial, single, all the fricatives are here. Welcome, everyone.
You need to turn yours.
A little which way? Good. This is why Ann is the producer.
You need to look this because you're going to be looking that way.
That is a great point. I don't usually have to look anyway. I just look right into my little computer screen.
Are we recording in?
You gonna give us a count?
That's Dakota.
Hi, Dakota.
Hey!
All right. Welcome to this special episode of Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Malinky.
And I'm Dr. David Hill. Today we're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. at the National Conference and Exhibition.
Yes, this is the unedited, behind-the-scenes version of your favorite articles from the journal Pediatrics. We get to be here with you to do the second annual live recording of Pediatrics on Call, and there is nothing like being in front of a live studio audience, so don't hold back. There's no hiding for David and I in our soundproof closets. It's just hot mics and hopefully some pediatric pearls.
And because this is a special day for us, we wanted to make it special for you too. Usually, we record our research roundup with one of the editors of Pediatrics. But today, for no extra charge, you get all three of them at the same time, and you get to peek or listen behind the curtain.
For our regular podcast recordings, David and I, we are heavily edited, but today we are uncensored, and you are too. So clap. Or boo, if you hear something you don't like. And we hope you hear yourself on the recording. Thank you for voicing your feelings and your opinions about our pediatrics team.
Now, this is the one time of year I don't have to make my own laughter and applause sound effects, unless I do. And let's start right now, because I want everyone to give a round of applause to our incredible producer, Ann Johnsos, who works to help us sound good by taking out all the
Hello,
puns.
Ann. Now, let's say hello to our guests. We have the esteemed Associate Editor of Digital Media for Pediatrics, Dr. Rachel Moon, known for Safe Sleep and her love of Korean Netflix dramas.
Oh, they don't have to be on Netflix. They can be any kind of Korean drama.
Korean dramas.
Any
And I do
streaming
want to, is this a foreshadowing or just a prediction or just a fact? I guess it's just a fact. I don't do puns, so don't expect any puns from me, please. Okay, so see,
Are
not
you
everybody likes
are you
puns.
punishing us by saying you don't do puns?
I think
First
that you,
boo of the night.
yeah, that was a punishment in and of itself.
Oh, it's already starting. The deputy editor of Pediatrics, an avid coffee drinker who's still yellow from all the questions he got at the National Conference and Exhibition last year as the self-appointed king of jaundice, Dr. Alex Kemper.
You going to say hello, Alex?
I will say hello. Thank you, David. Thank you, John. It's so exciting to be back here at the NCU with you all.
And last, but used to being first, Pediatrics Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Louis First, Vermont's finest pun purveyor. And here's hoping we can get him to sing live for you all. Louis, if you have a pediatric jingle you want to belt out, don't be shy.
Let's see if the spirit moves me as we move through this podcast.
Each of our editors has selected 3 or 4 of the most downloaded articles from the journal over the past year. We call this the Top 10 Plus list of articles a pediatrician sees the title for, has no time to actually read, and comes to the AAP's meeting in Washington, D.C. to finally learn about. Anyone else ready to learn?
All right, let's go. Right before this conference, I got my COVID-19 vaccine. I don't think we're calling it a booster anymore, but hopefully it's boosted my immune system a little bit to be in the room with all you healthy-looking people here today. Alex, now that we are coming out of the pandemic, are our patients catching up on their recommended vaccines?
You know, we published a lot of really important articles about vaccination over the past year. And let me take a stab at summarizing some of the important ones that thank you very much, that get to the issue of catching up. So the first one was a paper by Sarah Michaels and colleagues entitled Failure to Complete Multi-Dose Vaccine Series in Early Childhood. And as we all know, there are a lot of vaccines that are given in the first 2 years of life, and most of them are multi-series. So this was a study that was looking at are children actually completing the course of vaccinations early in life and what's associated with whether or not they complete it. And there's some important key summaries from this. So most but not all children do complete the series, but about 1 in 5 don't. And the ones that don't complete the series after they've started it, they're fairly close to finishing it. It wouldn't take that much work to get the vaccines completed, but there's some important lessons about the children that end up not completing their vaccines. 2 important ones I think you should remember are moving. So if a child moves, especially going from one practice to another practice, they can get lost and not complete the series, or if their insurance changes. That's another factor that's associated with not completing the vaccination. And I think that the vaccine series, and so this is an opportunity for you to think about communication and how to make sure that we close the loop with families. Flipping to the other side, you want to talk about the teens? There's a study that was looking at completion of the HPV vaccine series. This was a paper by Elizabeth Goodman and colleagues called Early Initiation of HPV Vaccination and Series Completion in Mid-Adolescence. And although the vaccine series for HPV is generally recommended for 11 and 12-year-olds, you can actually begin it as early as 9 years of age. And I'm just curious, how many people begin the vaccine series regularly earlier than 11? So I'm looking at the room and doing my math. It looks like a third of the people or so here begin the vaccine series early. The bottom line of this important study is that if you begin the vaccine series earlier, there's a greater likelihood of completing the series at the end. And we know that the HPV vaccine is a great way to protect individuals from cancer. If you have a patient population where it's hard to complete the series, I would really encourage you to think about starting it earlier. And then one other paper I want to talk about is what happens 10 years after HPV vaccination in terms of protection. And so we published a study by Restrepo and colleagues looking at the protection, the antibody protection 10 years after the vaccine series. And the bottom line for this is that between 80 and 90% of people who've completed the vaccine series still have high titers against HPV vaccine. And the fact that they still have high titers 10 years out really bodes well for the ensuing decades. And so this is a great message to share with families in terms of the duration of immunity. The other thing they looked at was whether or not there were any adverse outcomes that suddenly appeared down the road. As it turns out, there weren't. There weren't really any serious problems that came up. So again, a really good message to share with patients and families.
All right. Louis, I have always considered you to be an ace pediatrician. But in our world, we don't always have positive thoughts about ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences can be difficult for patients to talk about and might just re-traumatize them when we discuss them in a clinic setting. Can you pick up the pieces for us and share what a focus on positive childhood experiences might do for those with ACEs?
You all picked up on the pieces, PCE, positive childhood experiences. Very well done, David. Very well done. But I think all of you probably think, as I do, that I really don't like giving ACE scores to children. And to hear families in the waiting room say, my child is a 6. This is wrong. And it's because it's so wrong that we're now shifting the focus to what are called positive childhood experiences. And Dr. Cher Wang, who's at the Massachusetts General Hospital and colleagues, basically decided to say, we're always worried about adverse, but what about positive childhood experiences? And even more, what does that do to have an impact on adulthood? So what the authors did was a national longitudinal cohort of about 7,500 adults who were surveyed over the years. And I'm going to focus, in this study, they focus on 2014 and 2017. In 2014, this cohort were asked about their history of adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences. A positive childhood experience is a safe, stable, nurturing relationship. Just to give you, we all know the adverse childhood experiences, and they're not fun to talk about or mention. But the positives are, did you find comfort in your parent? Did you have a perception that your parents understood you? Did you have a positive relationship at school? Was your community supportive of you and your family? Those kinds of things. So they gave a score of 0 to 6 on positive childhood experiences. You could go 0, 1, 2, or 3+ on ACEs. And the question was, when you suddenly report in 2014 that you have a history of positive childhood experiences, what happens in 2017 when you're asked, how do you feel your overall health is, and do you happen to have any psychiatric or chronic medical conditions? And the bottom line of the study is, if you have 5 to 6 positive childhood experiences, you rate your health as, you have a 25% lower chance of saying my health is fair to poor, meaning your health is better. If you have a 5 to 6 positive childhood experience score, you have a 25% lower risk of having a psychiatric illness at the time you're surveyed in 2017. And if you have, as long as you have, when we put the ACEs in there, less than 3 ACEs, you still have a 16% lower risk of saying, I have a chronic physical or psychiatric illness and my health is better than it would be if I didn't have those positive childhood experiences. This is terrific. However, as soon as you cross 3 ACEs, the force of the positive doesn't last. So over 3 ACEs, suddenly this survey cohort says we have a 42% increased annual risk of having a chronic physical or psychiatric problem. So the name of the game is to keep the ACE count under 3 and move that positive childhood experience count up. And this study gives you lots and lots of information on it. But the question is, how do we actually do that? And so we got a commentary from Dr. Barb Frankowski, who's at the University of Vermont. Woo, woo. Sorry, a little University of Vermont shout out. But Dr. Frankowski basically takes a look at this particular study and says, this is terrific. This shifts us from ACEs to PCEs, but how do we do that? I mean, in a community setting, policy, food security, housing, these are great things, but when you have 20 minutes with a child in the office, you're not going to fix food security in your community. But what you can do is reshift the framework and be conscious and aware of, I'm going to build this visit with a positive framework to show families what a positive childhood experience is when they're not even calling it out. So this commentary has lots of frameworks to choose from. And then at the end of the commentary, what I really love is that Dr. Frankowski says, even if you don't want to pick a framework for your office, Find one positive thing happening in that encounter, point it out, and then get that family on the road to looking at positive childhood experiences. And these families will be picking up the pieces, and we will make a difference. So when you go back from this conference and as you're listening, make a conscious effort, not just to point out something if you see it, but to find it and think positive in each health maintenance visit. This is a great paper and commentary to think about.
I love that, Louis. That is so strength-based. And Rachel, as our resident sleep expert, we are going to challenge you to think about adolescents instead of infants. Schools have been starting later in the morning to accommodate the late-night bedtimes of many adolescents. But could the dream be that teens might actually go to bed earlier so they sleep longer? Or would that just be a nightmare for them?
That's an interesting question. If anybody who has ever lived with teenagers knows that that teenagers generally don't get enough sleep. And this is for a lot of reasons. They physiologically have a delayed circadian rhythm. So there's this natural shift so they don't feel the need to go to sleep until later. And then in addition, a lot of teenagers, they have a lot going on. They have schoolwork, they have extracurricular activities, they have friends and family, and all of this contributes to later sleep times. And I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, I heard it when my kids were teenagers, good grades, good friends, good sleep, pick two. And so, because the teenagers typically have to wake up early for school, they just don't sleep as much as they need to. And when they have sleep deprivation, that can negatively impact their academic performance, and that has also been associated with a host of medical and mental health issues, including overweight, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and substance use. And so, like Joanna said, there are a lot of experts, a lot of communities that have advocated for later school start times for the adolescents. But the question that Ian Campbell, PhD, and colleagues asks is, what if you could address sleep deprivation by something as simple as going to bed earlier? And I hear some laughter. So it's like, what? So they actually evaluated strategies to increase sleep duration for adolescents and young adults. So they took two cohorts of participants, a younger cohort, age 9 through 16, and they were studied every year for 3 years, and then an older cohort, 15 to 20, and they were studied once. And for 3 weeks, what they did was that they asked the participants to follow 3 different schedules for time in bed. So for 4 consecutive nights. So 7 hours in bed, 8.5 hours in bed, or 10 hours in bed. They had to wake up at the same time, so they basically got the increased time in bed by going to bed earlier. And then they used home polysomnography to measure sleep duration. And so even though some of the adolescents had a little bit of trouble falling asleep initially, the study showed that there was a fairly linear increase in sleep duration when the adolescents had an earlier bedtime. So the authors suggest that you could actually work on sleep deprivation in teenagers by just having them get in bed earlier. I don't know how hard of a sell this is going to be in real life, but I think that it's really an interesting idea and fairly simple, and I think that it's worth a shot.
Okay, 10 hours. I dream of that.
10 hours. I know, that would be amazing.
That would not be a hard sell for me.
I don't think it's a hard sell. I just think it's hard
for the teens
to do. Oh, a hard sell. Yeah, for the teens. Yeah.
It's that coffee, Alex. All right. Pediatrics is a sedentary activity, but many listeners tell us they listen while they're walking or running, so it's really just us not moving. At least we can't eat chips while we record. They are too crunchy. Alex, not many children host podcasts, but can you tell us a little bit about what pediatric risk factors there are for metabolic syndrome when sedentary children grow up?
So this was a study that was done. I know the study. that was spun by McDonald and colleagues called Childhood and Adolescent Television Viewing and Metabolic Syndrome in Mid-Adulthood. And this was a study that was done in New Zealand where they enrolled a birth cohort in the early 1970s and actually followed them out to 45 years of age. And they looked and see how much the people who were watching television over time. So every few years, their parents were asked about how much TV watching was going on. And then as they became adults, they reported for themselves. And then when they were 45, they were assessed to see who had metabolic syndrome and who didn't. So a couple of important things. So one is the rate of metabolic syndrome by adulthood was really high. So we're talking in between 20 and 30% for the men and women that were followed in this study. When you go back and look at TV watching was strongly associated with who developed metabolic syndrome as an adult, and it was dose dependent. So the more television that you watched, the more likely you were to go on and develop metabolic syndrome. This is a really great study, and one of the things that's really notable about it was that they were able to follow these people over 45 years of age. I think it helps that it was done in New Zealand, right? So it's an island, it's harder to leave, it's easier to find where everybody is. But this is really important for counseling families about the roles that television and sedentary activities can play on the later developments of metabolic syndrome. Now, of course, there are a lot of things that we don't know about in terms of what these adults were doing otherwise when they were young children. So it could be that the television watching was just a marker for other things related to sedentary behavior. So you can't draw a direct line from television watching to the development of metabolic syndrome, but it is a marker. The other thing is, think about how the landscape has changed, right? So in the early 1970s, there wasn't, iPads and Netflix and HBO Max online and ESPN and all those kinds of things. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I learned that when this birth cohort began, there was only one channel in all of New Zealand. Can you imagine? So things have changed, and although we don't have the science from this study to say it, I would say that the risk has probably really gone up. So something to think about and something to counsel your families about.
So wait a minute. If I watch a lot of healthy food shows for hours upon end, will I still get metabolic syndrome?
I think they only had that one channel, and it was probably like C-SPAN in New Zealand. So I think it probably doesn't matter what you watch.
I guess. All right.
And what are you snacking on when you're watching that TV, Louis?
That's a fair point.
There actually was a study where it came out on the news a few years ago that if you watched a lot of food shows, you did gain weight because you ate better.
Okay, so I wonder how many people like watching the British Baking Show? The Great British Baking Show. So like almost everybody. And should it now have to have like a warning on it?
That this could be dangerous for your health?
Correct.
Even though
Correct.
Some
Surgeon
new
General
advocacy.
says watching nice people bake together.
I think these programs are easy to digest. I really do.
Okay, that's the last bit of wordplay for this article.
Okay, and I just do because this part's going to get it edited out, I think. But I did that without the article in front of me. So,
Brains.
Well, now let's stray away from all the wordplay, people. Alex, you've left me thirsty to talk about strategies to reduce rates of overweight or obesity. Could the answer be clear and cool? I'm sorry, I actually did it, didn't I? Yeah. Oops.
So there was a paper that we published in this last year, Effectiveness of a School Drinking Water Promotion and Access Program for Overweight Prevention by Dr. Nisha Patel and colleagues at Stanford University, that asked the question, if you have access to water during school, can you address the risk of overweight and obesity? So this was a randomized trial. It was done within 26 schools. It began in 2016, and then for some reason, they had to stop it in 2020. I can't remember what was going on in 2020.
No idea.
I don't know what happened there. But they had an intervention that they called Water First, that I think they named after Lewis.
I'll drink to that.
You'll drink to that. So what they did was they did everything that they could do to make water easily available within the schools. So free access to water fountains. They actually promoted water drinking. They had family-based education about the importance of drinking water. They even gave little prizes when you drank water. Now, I'll confess my daughter is a kindergarten teacher, and I'm not sure if she would be happy about the downstream effects of doing this. But I guess, did it work? Let's take a peek. And what I can say is, if you're wondering whether or not this made a difference, you're in luck. You're in luck. Let me say it again. You're in luck.
We got it.
So, thank you. So, as it turns out, there was a reduction in the risk of overweight for those individuals who were in the schools that got the intervention with the water, compared to those who were in the schools where the program wasn't going. Everybody increased over time in terms of the proportion of overweight and obesity, but those that got the exposure had about a 3% reduction of transitioning to become overweight. Again, there was no difference related to obesity. And on one hand, you could say, well, 3%, is that an important difference? Well, if you think about it at a population level, that's a big difference. We're talking about a lot of children. And if we can prevent some children from transitioning, or if they maybe transition later to having overweight, we could really probably make a substantial difference. Now, they're continuing to follow these children. It's going to be interesting to see what happens down the road. But this is a pretty easy intervention. And I wouldn't be dissuaded by the fact that it's just a 3% difference in the risk of overweight. Again, at a population level, it could make a big difference. And I think it's an important piece of the puzzle.
I'm just going to take a quick drink.
You're so inspired.
Cheers to that. As a neonatologist, I get a lot of baby questions that extend well beyond the newborn period, and some of the questions drive me nuts. And I'm worried families are shell-shocked when I tell them to introduce peanuts early to their baby, Lewis. Can you help me with counseling around early peanut introduction?
Sort of cracking up at some of the puns there about peanuts. Food allergy papers, I think, are important ones to keep an eye on and to learn from. And we put one out. I'm just curious, how many of you are discussing early introduction of peanuts at 4 to 6 months? Good for you. Right? But this was a study by Dr. Wahid Samadi from Northwestern, who basically was concerned with colleagues about how often we are talking about the prevention of peanut allergy guidelines. These came out in 2017. And so what the investigators did was they got together a national survey of about 3,000 parents of children 7 months to 3.5 years. And they asked them what their awareness was about peanut allergy. They asked them about feeding practices. When did you introduce peanuts to your family? They asked them about, did you talk to the family about peanuts? Now, you may have thought you did, but the question is it getting through? Are you cracking through the shell and getting them to understand that this is an important thing to think about early introduction? And the bottom line is, it turns out that in this particular survey, not every child had a food allergy, but 13% of the several thousand parents said they do remember that there are some guidelines out there for peanut allergy. They also said that who was most aware of this? Parents who were older, 30 to 44, parents who were educated, high income, or cared for a child, as you might imagine, with a food allergy or eczema. About half of the parents felt, they said, giving peanuts early is a good idea. About half. 17% said we actually did that. So they may talk it, but they're not walking it. In fact, only 17% of this cohort gave peanuts before 7 months. About 40% did between 7 and 12 months. But the good news is those guidelines came out in 2017. That was about 12% of parents saying, I'm going to try peanuts early. By 2020, it was up to 25%. So you're doing a good job to start to say, let's do some early introduction. What was interesting is 50% or 57% or so of this cohort said, my pediatrician talked to me about peanuts. When they did, the odds of starting, if you started and talked about it before a baby reached 7 months of age, the odds ratio or the likelihood that they would introduce peanut was 16 to 1. If you don't talk about it, you're going to miss that window. 10%, however, of this cohort said, my pediatrician told me not to start peanuts until age 2. Yeah, ooh. Yeah, that was, I was shell-shocked at that as well. And the other thing that was interesting was even though parents said they knew they needed to do it, they didn't want to because they were fearful that their child a third of the time would have a reaction. And the reaction in this particular study was less than 1.4%. It was a little bit of hives. Nobody got seriously ill. So the bottom line is parents don't know about these guidelines. They're confusing. If you actually look at them, 4 to 6 months, if you have a strong family history or a child has eczema, you need to do skin prick testing. It's scaled up by the severity of eczema, and it's very hard to follow. So in 2020, the United States and Canada's allergy organizations changed the guidelines, if you didn't know that, and basically said now, don't do it, regardless of family history, 4 to 6 months, try the peanut. If there's truly a strong history of anaphylaxis to peanut, then you can do the skin prick testing. But otherwise, let's just clear the deck and tell everybody to start introducing peanut at 4 to 6 months. Needless to say, this is an important piece where we need to bring this together and bring this more into our office. If you're doing it, congratulations. If you're not, I think it's going to reduce complications of food allergy up the road as these kids get older.
And for kids who do develop food allergies and grow up with them, how do we make sure as adolescents they're equipped to manage them without ending up in our offices or even in the emergency department? Lewis, can you take a stab at that?
Thank you, Jonah. This is one of my favorite. If you missed this study, this was a study that came out this past year in our journal. Roxanne Dupuy and colleagues from the Harvard School of Public Health decided to look at teenagers who have a documented food allergy and were given an epinephrine autoinjector pen by you to use. And unfortunately, we know that adolescents carry the highest risk of death from anaphylaxis from a food allergy because they don't carry the epinephrine autoinjector pens, despite your telling them to carry it. So this was a randomized controlled trial. It wasn't a lot of people, but one group called Intervention 1 group got 30 text nudges. These are teenagers who had epinephrine injectors. 30 times over 10 weeks, they would get a text message saying, don't forget to go out with your epinephrine autoinjector pen. And it would just, hit them 30 times. Group 2 got the 30 nudges. They were actually called nudges, along with $100 in their epinephrine bank account. And what was going to happen is over the next 10 weeks, there would be a random call each week on their phone to say, it's time to show us your EpiPen, take a picture and put in the secret code word of the day. They had 30 minutes to make the pen appear. So what happened? In the first group that got the 30 nudges, needless to say, the results of this were rather interesting. 28% reported that they had their EpiPen who had gotten 30 nudges. 38% of the controls had the pen. So the people who got the nudges did worse than the controls. Group 2 got the money. 45% carried their epinephrine autoinjector pen versus 23% of the controls. But if you think about it, less than half of those teenagers were carrying their pens. What was really interesting is before the study started, they asked all these teenagers, on a scale of I always have the pen or I never have the pen, how certain are you that you have that pen with you? And the teenagers, 8 out of 10, they gave it an 8. In this study, it was less than 50%. So the question is, why is this? And while we can try and incentivize our teenagers, and you can say, well, why? They never did the study, by the way, with just the money only. But if you want to incentivize your teenagers and tell parents to put some money in the pot, it may do a little bit of good. The nudges are not going to do a lot of good. But here's a better idea, and I think the authors deserve a salute. Let's go upstream. Let's put epinephrine autoinjector pens in schools, in recreation areas, at public events, at concerts of major pop stars who are having an Eras tour. Why not? Well, people forget their EpiPen. And the reason is, have you seen these things? They're big, they're bulky, they look okay in a backpack, but otherwise, teenagers don't want to carry them. So I think what I want to have happen after the peanut article and the auto-injector articles, let's not do nothing, but let's talk food allergies and let's try some other strategies in our community to get people more sensitized to getting those epinephrine auto-injector pens in and starting the peanuts early.
Excellent.
Ooh, applause. Sorry.
All right, let's go back in time now to infancy and newborns. While in 2020 we had a record low infant mortality rate, we saw an increase in SIDS rates. Rachel, can you help us understand why and which of our patients are at highest risk for this devastating outcome?
Yeah, David, as you know, 1 out of 6 babies who die in the first year of life die suddenly and unexpectedly, and we call those SUID deaths, sudden and unexpected infant death. And as I think most of you know, there are 3 different subcategories of SUID. One is SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. One is cause unknown, and one is accidental suffocation and strangulation in bed. So Dr. Kiri Shapiro-Mendoza and colleagues at the CDC, they looked at the national trends of SUID between 2015 and 2020. And they also, since they were looking at 2020, they wanted to know if COVID actually, if the pandemic impacted those trends. The good news is just what you said, that the mortality rate went down. Actually, the SUID rate remained stable between 2015 and 2020. But there was an increase between 2019 and 2020 for infants who were identified as non-Hispanic Black. It had already been twice the rate of non-Hispanic white infants, but in 2020 it went to almost 3 times the rate. So that is not good. With regards to SIDS, those rates had been going down, but between 2019 and 2020, that rate went up, just like you said. And the first thought was, well, is this COVID? So they looked at that, and of the 3,300 babies who had died suddenly and unexpectedly, fewer than 10 of them had COVID on their as a primary cause of death on the death certificate. So it wasn't COVID. So another thing, another question was, could it be a change in coding these deaths? And there were some changes in 2019 in how medical examiners code sudden deaths. And at least there were changes in the recommendations. And it was decided that if a baby had died suddenly and unexpectedly, even if they were in an unsafe sleep environment, it should not be called accidental suffocation or strangulation unless there was direct cause of evidence of airway obstruction. So the thought was maybe it was just a change in classification, but as you know, for something to happen that quickly, 2019, and immediately happen, pretty unlikely. So there was actually, and this is a little awkward, because there's an invited commentary, and I was the person invited to commentate on this. And so, along with Dr. Rebecca Carlin at Columbia and Dr. Fern Houck from the University of Virginia, which is my home institution, we noted that there were several things that happened that were related to the COVID pandemic. So, as we all remember, everything shut down. There were disproportionate adverse outcomes for people who had fewer resources. So families had to leave the birth hospital earlier, so they may not have gotten safe sleep education. They may not have gotten lactation support. They may not have gotten information about not smoking around their babies. WIC offices closed, and that's a huge support for a lot of families, particularly those who are breastfeeding. Mental health services closed their doors. Programs that provide free and reduced cribs closed. And then, okay, so now I'm going to get on my soapbox. And at a baseline, we have such little support for families in general here in this country. Because there's no guaranteed family leave, paid family leave, there's lack of breastfeeding support. I could go on and on and on. But I think all of this probably contributed to the increased SIDS rate. So the article, I think, and our commentary, really do provide a call to action, an individual call to action. So we need to make sure that every family gets that teaching and gets that education and gets that support. But we also need to do something more on the community and the societal level to make sure that these programs that support these families remain funded and keep their doors open.
Thank you for that, Rachel. And let's pause after that for a breath of fresh air. And speaking of fresh air, what about croup? My husband's grandmother used to talk about bringing my father-in-law outside in the cold to help him breathe when he had croup. But Alex, is that cool?
I'm glad you asked. So I love studies that address common pediatric beliefs but for which there's no evidence. So I'm kind of curious, how many people routinely tell families if they have a child with croup to take the child outside when it's cold? Okay. I don't know what that is, maybe half or something like that. I mean, that was certainly something that I was taught as a resident to tell families. This year, we published a randomized trial looking exactly at that. This is a study that was written by Johann Siebert and colleagues at Children's Hospital Geneva, so Switzerland. They have cold air up there, as far as I know. What they did was they randomized children who were coming to the emergency department with croup to either get Decadron, dexamethasone alone, or to get dexamethasone and be put outside in the cold air when it was below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's the same thing as 10 degrees Celsius. And they looked and see how their croup score changed. They used the standardized croup score to evaluate the children at 30 minutes and then again at 60 minutes. So again, there were children put outside in the cold. The article is kind of funny because they talk about how there was somebody at the triage desk who could look out the window and I guess make sure they were okay. And I kind of imagine the child kind of scraping to get back in out of the snow. I'm sure the IRB said, triage desk, keep an eye on that person. But so what happened? There were about 120 children that were enrolled overall. And at 30 minutes, a little less than 25% of them who got to stay in the warm air and got the dexamethasone had improved croup scores, compared to 50% who were out in the cold did better. So at 30 minutes, there was a difference. If you look out to an hour, though, there was no difference between the two groups, and it was probably because, the steroids finally kicked in and were doing the magic. So I guess you could say, the intervention worked to a certain degree. Thank you. So it's kind of nice to have a study that shows that something that we commonly recommend works. The thing is, this study doesn't address cold air versus not doing anything. So it doesn't address the question about if you get a call in the middle of the night and you really think a child has croup, should you put them out in the cold air? And it also doesn't address repeated doses of cold air. But we already know from trials that we've published in pediatrics that dexamethasone really does make a big difference for croup. But the bottom line here is that cold air, at least as an adjunct to steroids, can make a difference in the first 30 minutes.
All right. Well, there's something else I'd like to talk about. Cannabis. I know that in my practice, I'm admitting more children than ever to the hospital for THC intoxication, mainly from gummies and similar edibles. Is it just me? Or, Louis, are the numbers really higher?
It's just you, David.
Oh, man.
No. Actually, how many of you have experienced the complication of a child getting into an edible from THC? Well, this is what I want to talk about. We've had 2 articles come out this year. The first one just took a look from 2017 to 2021 by Dr. Marit Tweet from Southern Illinois University, who basically by 2021, 23 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized recreational marijuana. So with that in mind, looking 2017 to 2021, this was an analysis of national poison system data. It was 55 centers looking at children less than 6 who got into edibles. And I think what's real, everybody knows these are cookies, gummies, et cetera, that go through. And looking at the clinical effects, the outcomes, what happened. And I'm just going to give you some, even if you're just listening, you don't need to see a slide here. In 2017, the National Poison Centers reported 207 children who got into an edible. In 2021, 3,054 cases, 200 to 3,000. And this is just those that called the Poison Center. Who are they? 25% or so are 2-year-olds, another 25% are 3-year-olds. So 50% of the kids who are curious and getting into cabinets, things like that, and getting to them. 70% of the cases that got to a poison center showed central nervous system depression, sedation. 2% had coma. A quarter of them, roughly, were admitted because of concerns about cardiovascular, GI, ocular, respiratory, as well as the CNS signs. This is a concern. The question is why, particularly during the pandemic years, do we see this increase? And I think the authors don't prove this, but they raise a number of suspects in the parlor with the monkey wrench. I mean, you can imagine, first of all, everybody's home. Everybody's hungry and everybody's home. More products are being purchased in states where THC, where cannabis has been legalized. There are products, the edibles are coming with more and more concentrated THC in the product. And finally, they come in multiple dose packages. So now the question is, how much of a dose, when you get a call that my child ate the cookie or the gummy, and by the way, David, 50% plus for gummies, just to let you know with your collection, just keep it locked up.
I appreciate that.
Exactly.
Mainly brownies over here.
Brownies, okay. But the truth of the matter is, how much of a dose is too much of a dose? It turns out that the average, so to do this, Dr. Leslie Pepin from Denver, Colorado, who is located in the Rocky Mountain Poison Drug Safety Program in Denver, decided to look within the Denver health system at a number of hospitals and calls that came in to Rocky Mountain Poison regarding THC edible ingestions. And this was really interesting because in Colorado, they have made it a point that you have to have, theoretically, on the package, the dose of THC that's in the product. So what happened, basically 80 edibles were reported, there were 325 encounters, but only 80 could parents recall or see because they'd opened the package, the dose of THC. So they were working off of that. And it turned out that the average dose of an ingestion for a child ranged from 0.2 milligrams per kilogram to 69 milligrams per kilogram. That's a lot. The average edible is 10 milligrams of THC. I learned, Alex Kemper taught me that.
I'm here for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I got the Doritos too.
And what the authors found out that basically most of these kids got signs and symptoms within 2 hours, got severe by 4 hours. A dose of 2.3 milligrams per kilogram basically had a sensitivity of 89% and a specificity of 86%. If you drop it to 1.7 milligrams per kilogram to say, how is that predictive of how long kids are going to be sedated? The sensitivity, again, is 89.2%, specificity 86.1%. Bottom line that they're suggesting is that we probably should arrive at a dose of anything 1.7 milligrams per kilogram or higher should tell you these kids need to be observed probably in an inpatient setting or an observation unit in an emergency department. As I said, the common dose is 10 milligrams for an edible. But these come multiple. And so when you get a small child and they're having multiple 10 milligram doses, this is a problem. The American College of Toxicology in 2019 called for changes in packaging, and the great state of California has stepped up to pass new child-resistant packaging laws on edibles, opaque packages so you can't see what's in the package, and the Poison Center hotline number is on every edible package. At least this is what they say is happening in California. Other states are now passing similar laws. This is a call for advocacy. I mean, this has now been recreationalized, but if we can help with the packaging and the state laws to get the dose on there and for you to know that anything above 1.7 milligrams per kilogram is well worth paying attention to, then, or I should say, this is potentially important information to hold on to.
And any future for THC-laced Brussels sprouts?
Actually, no one will touch that.
Okay.
So if you put high doses in Brussels sprouts, no child is going there. So there you go.
There's a solution and a business opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about something that doesn't seem to be going up, the number of qualified developmental pediatricians to diagnose and treat children who have autism spectrum disorder. And I'm curious, how many developmental pediatricians in the room today? How many general pediatricians? Awesome. So kids are waiting for months and even years to see a developmental specialist. Is there any solution to this bottleneck, Rachel?
That is a great question, Joanna. So how many people here have a child who is waiting to be diagnosed with autism? Almost everybody. Yeah. Where I practice, it's almost a year until you get in to see a developmental behavioral specialist. And this is a problem because even though we can diagnose it at much younger ages, the mean age of diagnosis in the U.S. is older than 4 years of age. And we know that the earlier they get into early intervention, then the better that they do. So in Indiana, anybody here from Indiana? Nobody here from Indiana. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about them. So in Indiana, they've actually developed a statewide training for community primary care providers, so people just like you, to provide streamlined evaluations for toddlers and preschoolers who have suspected autism spectrum disorder. And so this system is called the Early Autism Evaluation Hub, or EAE Hub. So these hub clinicians, they get referrals from other providers to evaluate the children who are suspected of having autism spectrum disorder. And they do standardized screening, uses Ages and Stages questionnaire, the MCHAT, a focused developmental history and clinical interview, a physical exam, and then the screening tool for autism in toddlers. So in the study that we published this year in Pediatrics by Rebecca McNally Keene, PhD, and colleagues, they compared, they looked at 120 children, and they compared the evaluation from the hub clinician with the evaluation of a clinical psychologist. And the results are really positive, and I was very excited about this. So sensitivity and specificity of the hub evaluation were higher than 80%. And the positive predictive value was 93%. The negative predictive value was 62%. And the major area where the evaluations differed was when the hub clinician couldn't tell if the child had autism spectrum disorder or global developmental delay. But the hub clinician almost always said, I can't tell. So they knew that they needed an expert evaluation for those children. So I thought that this was a great study, and in Virginia, they're actually starting to do this as well. Any other states starting to do this? There are people from a few states, yeah. So I think that this is really, really promising. And so we know, actually, also from a commentary that was that we invited from Dr. Susan Hyman and Abigail Croning from the University of Rochester, they noted that these children, they really can't wait an extra year or two to get services. So while we need to be sure that there are programs that provide services for these children, we also need to make sure that, that we get these children into services earlier. And so programs like this that allow primary care providers to become comfortable in their ability to make these diagnoses and make these referrals, I think will be an important first step.
I think that would be revolutionary. Now, I'm very happy because usually by now this session would have gone down the tubes. But you
I got it. Keep going.
You know where we're going?
Hold on.
You know where we're going, Louis. Tympanostomy tube placement is still one of the most common surgical procedures in early childhood. Is there a point at which we might do better to just take a wait-and-see approach to recurrent otitis media? Alex?
I'm glad you asked, David. So we published a study called Window of Susceptibility to Acute Otitis Media Infection by Peter Bojersky and colleagues in Rochester, where they looked at whether there was a period at which children with an episode of otitis media were more likely to get a second episode. So before I get into this, I'm just curious, how many people have ever treated someone with otitis media? All right. Fortunately, I'm in the right room. So in this study, they enrolled about 300 children, and they followed them very closely over time. And for those with suspected otitis media, they actually did a tympanocentesis to confirm whether or not the child had otitis. Now, I know everybody does tympanocentesis routinely in their practice, right? Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine? So they, like I said, were very interested to find out what the risk factors were associated with having a follow-on episode of otitis media. And as it turns out, if you have an episode of otitis media, your window of susceptibility to having a second, third, fourth, or so on more episodes are really within 5 months, and in most cases closer to 2 months of having that episode. And there were other factors that were associated with increased likelihood of having otitis media. So to absolutely no one's surprise, one of them is daycare. Another one is the age of the child. So the younger you are, the more likely you are to go on to have a second or more cases. And of course, the more cases you've had, you know, this is one of those cases where past performance does predict future activity, unlike the stock market or something like that. And so in this paper, they were able to define risk factors that would make you think that the child is going to go on to develop recurrent otitis media, to have multiple new episodes of recurrent otitis media. And they raised the question that if you know that a given child is likely to go on to have another episode of otitis media, maybe we should actually be putting the tubes in earlier, maybe waiting until they've had multiple before we bite the bullet and send them to ENT to get the tube put in. Maybe we should put the tube in earlier. Now that really flies in the face of the work that we're doing to try to reduce unnecessary care. So it's a provocative question, but they did look at a small sample of children who got earlier PE tubes and the risk of going on to develop subsequent ear infections. And as you might imagine, getting the tubes in earlier is helpful. So I think this is a provocative study in terms of what does this mean for the future of putting in tubes. But it's also practically helpful when you're seeing a family where the child has otitis media in terms of predicting what might happen. And so the family's not surprised or disappointed and sad if the child were to get another episode of otitis media. So I think it's practically helpful now, and I think it opens up all sorts of questions about the future in terms of the role of tubes.
And I'm looking at Ann, our producer, as I often do when we're recording. Do we have time for audience questions? I know we were hopeful. We do not. But we can hang out for a minute, maybe, and answer questions. Are you guys tight on time?
Sure.
All right. So if anyone has questions, we wanted to put you on the recording, but we'll just have you stay after. So let's finish up this recording.
Joanna, can you just ask for a final thought or a song?
Oh, yes, we're going. Yes, Ann, we're going to get
Well,
there.
I'm glad you asked, because I do have a song. Actually, it is not me.
Oh, well, now I'm excited. But Rachel, Alex, Lewis, we've covered so much today, and I cannot believe we are celebrating 75 years of the Journal Pediatrics. That is 3/4 of a century. That's incredible.
Well, how time flies when you're putting out articles that we think make a difference. But you know what, Joanna, David? If words will not convince you what the journal means to the improvement of child health through the discoveries that are there over the past 75 years, maybe a closing song will.
Yes.
So for those of you who've never heard me sing on Pediatrics on Call, there's a good reason. This probably may not even make
doors. Could we lock the doors in the back?
This may not make the live podcast, so this is just as well. But those of you who are still in the room, too bad. The song I have rewritten to salute our 75th is from the Broadway musical Pippin, with the music by Stephen Schwartz. I have rewritten the lyrics. And Dakota, if you could give me the piano accompaniment. Now we got it. If you love practicing peds each and every day, and I hope that that is true, you're probably busy from morning to night, and it's tough to keep up on what's new. But there is a way to stay current and keep up with your peers. It's thanks to a peer-reviewed journal that's been around for 75 years. When you need to know something about THC, or if you can for autism, screen. There's plenty to learn about food allergy and what PCEs really mean. It's never too late, you don't have to wait. It makes you feel more secure of helping to make each patient feel great. What we publish, you can be sure of. Oh, it's time to start reading so your practice improves from the info we're feeding. A clinical problem you will learn to fix. Happy 75th Pediatrics. Have you ever wondered when teens should hit the sack, or when screen time should make you afraid? How about what to do for a croup attack, or make sure vaccines are not delayed? Maybe it's meant that the years that we've spent putting out studies to make children well Well, so many issues came and then went. I'd say they all have gone to helping kids to start living. Time to celebrate all that the journal has given. 75 years, so many illnesses we did fix. And with each month's issues, we do strive to make sure children's health will thrive. Happy anniversary, Pediatrics.
Oh, wow.
Thank you. We got there. We got there. Happy 75th, Pediatrics.
Wow.
And you're on your way, Pediatrics on Call, in just a matter of time, the 75th.
Oh, wow. And
Anniversary of
we will
Pediatrics on Call.
Still be here.
Still.
Oh, that is it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. I don't know if he's here. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll focus on promoting health equity through Medicaid and CHIP.
We'll talk to the authors of a new policy statement, Drs. Jennifer Kuzma and Jean Raphael. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Balinki. Thanks for listening.